Welcome, everyone. I think we're going to get started. Thanks for coming. Tonight, we have our Metro DC DSA Socialist Night School session on Reconstruction and Democracy in the South. And I just want to confirm we are recording. Yep. And we are also live on YouTube. So I just want to introduce myself. My name is David Kaib. I'm one of the organizers of the night school. My pronouns are he and him. The Metro DC DSA Socialist Night School is a series of currently weekly sessions that explore basic ideas, concepts, and historical events related to socialism. This is in our fourth semester, and we've covered more things than I can count, so I'm not going to go through all that. But you can check us out if you're part of the chapter on the chapter Slack at political-education. You can also find us at Twitter at nightschool_DC, and you can email us at politicaleducation@mdcdsa.org. It's all one word, and we'll share that stuff again in the chat. If you have any problems with the audio or video, please let us know in the chat. Tonight's session is going to be led by Robert Greene II, an assistant professor of history at Claflin University. He completed his Ph.D. at the University of South Carolina in 2019. His areas of research are Southern history since 1945, African-American history, and American intellectual history since Reconstruction. Dr. Greene serves as a book reviews editor at the Society of U.S. Intellectual Historians. He also serves as lead instructor for the South Carolina Progressive Network's Modjeska Simkins School of Human Rights. Finally, Dr. Greene has published several book chapters and scholarly articles and has written for popular publications. You may have seen him in The Nation, Oxford American Dissent, Scalawag, Jacobin, and In These Times. So now I'm going to turn it over to Robert. We will leave time for question at the end, so save them until we are ready. Take it away, Robert. I think you may be muted. I still can't hear you.
Yeah, Rob, you're off mute, but we can't hear you. Do you have like a microphone turned off or something? Okay. Sorry about this. We're having a brief technical difficulty. This is Chip Gibbons, he, him, his pronouns. We're having a brief technical difficulty, and Rob is going to log out and log back in, and that should hopefully solve the problem. Ask to unmute. Okay, I've asked him to unmute. Rob, are you back? Robert?
Yes, I am back.
I can hear you now, but your video is now off.
Well, the thing is with the video, it says once again your host has stopped it.
Okay.
Lots of moving parts here, folks. I'll be with you in a second.
Hold on, I'm making you co-host again. See, when you're the host, you can do whatever you want.
There we go. All right, fantastic. Sorry about that, those technical difficulties, folks. Trust me, I understand. I've been teaching a night school this summer, so we've had some of the same issues with Zoom. But as I was saying earlier, my name is Robert Greene II. I'm very, very happy to join you guys this evening. I am quite hopeful that you'll enjoy tonight's session, and I will say that I often find the Q&A session, parts of the sessions, to be particularly illuminating. So what I'm going to do tonight is offer a basic overview of the Reconstruction period. There's a lot of the Reconstruction era that you can't entirely cover in 2 hours, but I want to give you guys tonight are essentially the basics of Reconstruction, things that you really want to understand about the era that are critically important to the story of Reconstruction, and more broadly important to the story of America in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. Now, my story is actually going to begin in two places, in 1861-62, actually before we traditionally start the Reconstruction era. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have a couple of PowerPoint presentations I want to share with you guys that I think will help guide us along with tonight's session pretty easily. Now, the thing about the Reconstruction era is that at the beginning of tonight's discussion, I want to center the state of South Carolina. Of course, that's the state that I'm in right now. Unfortunately, the news at the moment, South Carolina is pretty prominent because we're one of the hot spots for the COVID-19 pandemic across the entire world. But South Carolina has also been really important in terms of thinking about race in American society. And in particular, when we're talking about the Reconstruction period, South Carolina becomes incredibly important because it's a state that was not only the site of the beginning of the American Civil War, but it's also a site where our ideas about Reconstruction really take shape. So what I actually have on the screen for you guys right now is a map of the coast of South Carolina. And in particular, it points you out to the location place called Port Royal. Now, Port Royal, South Carolina in 1861 was one of the first places in the Confederacy to fall to federal forces during the war. In Port Royal, of course, on the coast of South Carolina, it was home to a couple thousand enslaved Africans there, and their owners actually fled the coastline in November of 1861. Now, when federal soldiers made it to Port Royal, the first question they had for themselves, and the first question most members of Congress had was, well, will people of African descent actually work if they are not enslaved? Thus began what was called the Port Royal experiment, which was an effort to essentially see if formerly enslaved Africans would actually work for essentially a decent wage. And this experiment involved thousands of Africans. It also involved Union soldiers. It involved school teachers and other leaders from the New England area primarily who came to Port Royal to educate these people, to help them learn the benefits of wage labor. And what they found was that Black people were more than happy to work. They're more than happy to work for fair wages. However, it's important to note, and I think with this being a socialist reading group especially, this is a very important lesson to know. What's important to note is that no one really asked Black people of Port Royal what they actually wanted. Now, the people of Port Royal tended to want their own piece of land. They wanted to be left alone to labor on their own, whereas the people coming from the North were trying to instruct them in the ways of capitalism and the ways of wage labor. Remember, at the beginning of the Civil War, there's this idea that the war is very much between a slave-holding South and a pro-capitalist, pro-wage labor North. And certainly the folks coming down to the Port Royal experiment from New England, they're hoping that they can teach Black people the glories and the promises of capitalism and wage labor. There's already this tension between Black people on the ground and white Americans who are coming in ostensibly to help them that you're going to see play out over and over again during the Civil War and especially during the Reconstruction period. In a lot of ways, our story of Reconstruction begins with this experiment, this decision by the federal government to see if Blacks would work for fair wages, and they would. But they didn't go a step further and then say, well, what do Black people actually want? This tension within Reconstruction between what the federal government believes is best and what Black Americans on the ground in the South want is really going to be at the center of our story this evening. Now, I know I start with the Port Royal experiment, and this is really the beginning of Reconstruction because after Port Royal, Republicans in Congress are going to really use this as an example of what can be done with Black people once the Reconstruction period begins. And in a lot of ways, Reconstruction has its beginnings in the Port Royal experiment, but it also has its beginnings in another really important moment across the country in 1862. And this is, I think, again, a really important way to frame our discussion this evening. We tend to start the Reconstruction discussion with the end of the Civil War, but you have to remember that people were discussing, debating Reconstruction long before that. Certainly, people of African descent were wondering what's going to happen to us once the war is over and when slavery is brought to a decisive end. Now, on December 31st, 1862, in Black churches across the United States, thousands upon thousands of African Americans were sheltered in various churches, praying that a message from President Abraham Lincoln would finally be delivered. Now, in September of 1862, President Lincoln had released what was called the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And basically, this proclamation stated that on January 1st, 1863, all people held in bondage across the South would be, after that date, henceforth and forever free, if the South did not give up its war against the federal government. Now, between September and December of 1862, there had been a series of Union military setbacks in the battlefield, and there was some uncertainty as to whether or not President Lincoln would actually follow through on his Emancipation Proclamation. And so thousands of mostly Black audiences across the North prayed on December 31st, 1862. Then shortly after midnight, couriers carrying a message from President Lincoln throughout the North made it to these churches and stated that essentially the Emancipation Proclamation had officially been decreed by President Lincoln. Now, this transforms the American Civil War from a war about Union to both a war for Union, or restoration of the Union, and a war for emancipation. With that being said, of course, it means that the idea behind emancipation is going to lead to another question. What happens to Black people once the Civil War is over? And this is part of a larger narrative during the Civil War era. The country is changing dramatically in ways that really cannot be imagined even as late as 1861. Now, after the Emancipation Proclamation is issued, you have tens of thousands of Black Americans fighting in the Civil War, of course, in regiments as famous as the 54th Massachusetts Regiment that was seen in the film Glory. Valor on the battlefield and the importance of Black Americans to the war effort really helps to change this question of who gets to be an American citizen. Now, that idea of citizenship is really important because remember, before the Civil War, there aren't really straight and ironclad laws about national citizenship. There are certainly laws about citizenship state by state, but there isn't really a national full definition of citizenship that everyone follows. And this has really calamitous consequences, especially for Black people. You think about the 1857 Dred Scott decision, where Chief Justice Roger Taney basically said that Black Americans, whether enslaved or free, had absolutely zero rights in front of federal law. During the Civil War, of course, that's going to have to change. And with valor on the battlefield and with political protests across the country, Black Americans are really making their voices heard in a way that they have never been able to do so before. The question is shifting from the end of slavery to the beginning of citizenship, a question that Black people have been asking in America for generations, but is now finally coming to the fore during the Reconstruction period. And I want to set up that frame tonight because this is really at the center of our Reconstruction story this evening. Images like this one, this is actually a political cartoon from the famous Harper's Weekly publication. And I can assure you they were not publishing letters at the time about freedom of speech laws and all of that, but they were certainly publishing a lot of stories about the idea of freedom and citizenship in American society in the 1860s and 1870s. Now put yourself in the shoes of an American citizen, a white American citizen around 1865, 66. And you see an image like this one, where you are confronted with a symbol of America. You see the woman there, Columbia, pointing to a Black veteran of the Civil War. And she's asking in the caption, "And not this man," basically saying, how can we not give men such as these who fought and died and gave everything they could for the sake of the Union cause, some sort of political and social and economic rights that come with being an American citizen? Again, in the 1865-66 period and going a little bit beyond that, one of the things that pro-citizenship advocates are pointing out is that there were thousands of African Americans who fought and died in the Civil War, who fought to basically save the Union. And there is a growing sense that we should try to guarantee rights for them. And again, this is radical revolutionary. Most Americans, white Americans that is, weren't even thinking about granting, say, voting or political rights to Black people in 1860 or 61 or 62. And yet by 1865, we're at the precipice of a real revolution in political social rights in America. Now, a great deal of this revolution, in fact, is based on the fact that the South itself has been utterly devastated by the Civil War. This is the photograph from Charleston, South Carolina in 1865. Of course, again, coming back to South Carolina for a moment, the state was seen by many across the country as being the epicenter of secessionist thought throughout the 19th century. And it was the first state to secede from the Union in December of 1860. By 1865, the state, which was once one of the leaders of slavery in the country, has been destroyed. But there is a sense on the ground from federal soldiers, from recently freed African Americans, and so on, that this post-war period may offer the best chance yet to make South Carolina a truly small d democratic piece of the Union. Now, South Carolina before the Civil War had been quite repressive in terms of its voting rights, even for white citizens. It was certainly not a model for democracy, even by 19th century standards. But after the war, the state would become one of the chief symbols of what Reconstruction both could and could not achieve. We'll come back to this in just a moment. This is also a picture of Columbia, South Carolina, 1865. I'm actually coming to you live from just outside of Columbia right now. Again, you want to think about where the country is quite literally in a physical sense, how so much of the South has been destroyed and devastated by the war, but there is this sense among most in the federal government that this is now a time for a fresh start. Really quickly, I do want to remind folks, and we can talk about this more in the Q&A later on this evening, that while this is all going on in the East and the South, I don't want to lose sight of the fact that the federal government is also prosecuting multiple wars against indigenous peoples out West. This is going on during the Civil War with the Dakota War of 1862 in present-day Minnesota and events like the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864. During the Reconstruction period, as the country is trying to rebuild the South and for some reshape what the South can and should be politically, socially, and even economically, there is also the push out West to disrupt and potentially destroy indigenous tribes for the sake of gaining more land for westward expansion and growth of the white population out West. Again, these two things are happening at the same time. And I want folks to keep that in mind, that the Reconstruction era from 1865 until roughly 1877 is not just an era of Black political advancement and then retrenchment. It's also an era of westward expansion. It's also an era of great labor disruption, which we'll talk about later on too. But there are a lot of balls in the air for the United States, and there are a lot of turning points here for the country historically that could have gone different directions. Now, arguably one of the most important events in the history of Reconstruction is actually the death of Abraham Lincoln in April of 1865. Now, one refrain you'll hear from a lot of historians is that, frankly, we aren't really sure of what President Lincoln would have done during the Reconstruction period. We do know that early on during the war, he had already talked about trying to bring back into the federal union the southern states without any punitive measures whatsoever, that he wanted to bring them back by having 10% of Union loyalists vote for a new state constitution and then they will be restored back to the Union. Lincoln wanted to make Reconstruction as quick as possible. But with that said, it is worth noting that right before he is killed, in Lincoln's final public address, also in April of 1865, Lincoln talks about granting the right to vote to Black men of a certain level of intelligence or to Black veterans of the Civil War. He was the first president in American history to talk about granting Black men the right to vote. And there is even an argument that has been made that the reason John Wilkes Booth actually kills Lincoln is in retaliation for Lincoln's statement. It's believed that Booth was in the crowd for Lincoln's final speech. And apparently when Booth heard Lincoln talk about granting Black men the right to vote, that was the moment he decided to go from trying to kidnap President Lincoln and part of his cabinet to deciding to assassinate him. It wasn't so much about the Civil War for John Wilkes Booth as it was about the future of the country as a whole. But again, we don't know how Lincoln would have reacted to events on the ground in the South and across the country during the Reconstruction era. But suffice to say, Lincoln's biggest mistake during his presidency, at least one of his biggest ones, was naming Andrew Johnson as his vice presidential nominee in 1864. That was going to have calamitous effects with Reconstruction in the years to come. Now, again, in 1865, there is this sense in the North that there is relief that the war is over. But despite the fact that you have these massive gatherings in support of the Union, you have 150,000 U.S. troops march through Washington, D.C. in May of 1865, politicians in Washington are beginning to realize, oh, wait a minute, we won the war, but now we've got to actually win the peace. And we've got to figure out how to reincorporate the South into the Union. Again, we've been at war for 4 years. It was a brutal war, the bloodiest war in American history. Hundreds of thousands of men have died. The civilian population of the South has been devastated by the war. And oh, by the way, there are 4 million people who are now free who weren't free just not too long ago. This idea of switching from war to reunion of the entire country is one that is going to perplex American politicians for the next decade or so. And really, the effects of the decisions in 1865, 66, and going forward are going to linger in the American consciousness in our American political system for generations to come. Now, I mentioned Andrew Johnson a moment ago, and I want to very quickly talk about who he was and why he's important to this story. Of course, Johnson was Lincoln's running mate in the 1864 election. He was formerly a Democrat from Tennessee, and he was, in fact, the only Southerner to stay in the Senate during the Civil War. As a reward for his loyalty to the Union, Lincoln appointed Johnson military governor of Tennessee, and later on, he decided to show the entire nation that he was dedicated to Union. Lincoln named Johnson, again, a former Democrat, his running mate in the 64 election. Now, Lincoln did this as a Republican, not really thinking he'd be killed within a month after being inaugurated as president again in 1865. But once Lincoln is killed and Johnson becomes president, there is this initial assumption north that Johnson will do right by the recently freed slaves. That Johnson, being a poor white himself, being someone who was ardently against the planter class of the South, the assumption is, well, Johnson will look out for Black people as he has looked out for poor whites across the South. And initially, even amongst Black activists like Frederick Douglass, there is this expectation that Johnson will do right by Black people. By the end of 1865, it becomes quite clear that Johnson's policy, what's called presidential Reconstruction, is in fact not going to do right by Black people in the South. And that Johnson is more concerned with a quick Reconstruction, bringing Southern states back into the fold fairly quickly, and really ignoring the plight of most African Americans. Now, the federal government was bitterly divided over the question of Reconstruction. And while Johnson and most Democrats favored a quick Reconstruction, along with a few conservative Republicans, the more radical wing of the Republican Party, led by Thaddeus Stevens in the House and Charles Sumner in the Senate, they were really thinking that this was their chance to fundamentally alter the South for the better for the foreseeable future. And Stevens, the man you see here in the photograph, Sumner and other radical Republicans believed that Reconstruction should have been much more punitive, that it should have punished the white South for seceding from the Union. At the same time, word is trickling back to Washington, D.C. by the end of 1865 that in the South, the new state governments are creating state constitutions that include provisions in them that are called black codes. These black codes are laws that essentially try to bring the status of black people as close to slavery as possible without actually enslaving them. By the end of 1865, of course, the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery has been passed and it's been ratified, not part of the Constitution. And so they can't be enslaved. But what Southern governments figured out was that we could do everything else to black people short of enslaving them. So if you look at the various black codes on the books in 1865, they include things such as saying that if you're black, you can only move to certain areas, or you have to have identification with you at all times. You have to have a white person vouch for your character before you can move from one place to another, so on and so forth. These black codes were very much racist in origin, but they were also very much about controlling labor. And again, this is going to be at the heart of Reconstruction. Who controls black labor? And who controls black political and social power is going to be at the heart how Reconstruction changes over time. And certainly Republicans are blanching at what they're seeing coming out of the South. In addition to that, at the end of 1865, you do see congressmen from the South returning to Washington, D.C. for the first time since the Civil War began. And these congressmen from the South include members of the former Confederate Congress, members of the Confederate Cabinet, even Alexander Stephens, who was the vice president of the Confederacy, has been elected to Congress from Georgia and is coming to Washington, D.C. in December of 1865. Republicans are absolutely incredulous that the very people they were fighting against during the Civil War are now returning to Congress as though nothing actually happened during the previous 4 years. It's an extraordinary event, but it pushes even moderate to conservative Republicans to begin to support the radical Republican options for Reconstruction. Meanwhile, African Americans are also watching and waiting to see what will happen next. Activists such as Frederick Douglass, amongst many others, are now pushing Congress to begin considering the right to vote for Black men. And for folks like Douglass, this idea is not simply a question of political expediency. It is quite literally a matter of life or death for Black people all across the South. The idea being that if you grant Black men the right to vote, they can protect themselves via the ballot box from white aggression, from white terrorism, and so forth. And as you're about to see, during the Reconstruction era, this idea will come up again and again and again. Now, one of the things about the Civil War in Reconstruction that I really want to point out is that the way that we think of the federal government today in 2020, a lot of it has its origins during the Reconstruction period. Namely, this idea of creating a social safety net or social welfare services for the greater good of citizens across the country. A lot of that begins thanks to things like the Freedmen's Bureau during the Civil War. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau is something you probably vaguely recall from learning about Reconstruction in K through 12 or in college, but it's worth noting that the Freedmen's Bureau was designed to not just help Black Americans, but to help poor whites across the South as well. It was meant to be a place where if you were a victim of the Civil War, you could come and apply for relief, get an education, and so forth. But the Freedmen's Bureau quickly becomes associated with Black people because Black people are willing to use their services. Now, in the South, imagine, if you will, that you're a recently freed slave. You're someone who has not learned how to read or write, but you have a desire to start a family, to own land, to make a name for yourself. And really, above all, just be left alone and just be able to survive on your own, as any other American wants to do. The Freedmen's Bureau is really important because they'll sign contracts for you, they'll provide protection for you, in terms of being harassed legally, and they will certainly provide aid to you in terms of figuring out how to purchase land, how to acquire economic self-determination for yourself, and so forth. But the Freedmen's Bureau, in a lot of ways, becomes one of the first targets of, in American history, a resistance to the welfare state, a resistance to social safety nets or social services. And you're going to see some language during this conversation that will sound very familiar to you in 2020 in terms of thinking about who has a right to help from the federal government and who doesn't have a right to help from the federal government. Now, people like George Fitzhugh, a Southern intellectual who was ardently pro-slavery before the Civil War and is deeply opposed to Black equality after the war, he argues that the Freedmen's Bureau is basically what he calls a Negro nursery. It's this idea that gains traction North and South during Reconstruction that Black people are growing too dependent on aid from the federal government. I'm sure we've all heard this argument before. It is not new. It doesn't begin in 2020. It doesn't begin during the Reagan administration. It doesn't begin during the Civil Rights Movement. You can find the origins of this idea during the Reconstruction period. Again, this is a really good example of how Reconstruction still lives with us today. The idea of thinking of Black people as being too dependent on federal aid has its origins in this era. Now, the irony here is that if things had gone one particular direction, then perhaps these kinds of arguments would have been quickly stopped and would have had an example of what we might call the redistribution of wealth. Now, I have on the screen here a description of what's now known colloquially as 40 acres and a mule. This idea that has been passed down from generation to generation amongst African Americans, amongst radical circles in American society, that Black people were owed something after the Civil War, that they were owed something after their enslavement. Now, in 1865, General William T. Sherman issues Special Field Order Number 15, which essentially confiscated thousands of acres of land along the coasts of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida that once belonged to planters and slaveholders. And he decreed that land should be given to recently freed Black people across the region. Now, the idea is very simple. Each person, each family would get a parcel of land, roughly 40 acres in size. They may or may not receive a mule to help them work that land. Most of the mules, of course, were federal government surplus. And throughout the summer and fall of 1865, this idea does take hold first in the coastal areas of the South, and then it spreads across the South like wildfire. So you have Black people across the South hearing rumors of 40 acres and a mule and demanding land that they believe they were owed because of their service and their slavery during and before the Civil War. Now, in the coastal area of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, most Black people were able to hold onto this land under protection of the Freedmen's Bureau until the end of 1865, when President Andrew Johnson, trying to appease slaveholders that he is pardoning, decides that the land should be given back to slaveholders who once held it. Now, on the ground in the South, you have these tragic moments where Freedmen's Bureau workers are talking to Black people and telling them, look, we know you've been working this land for the last 4 to 6 months, but now you've got to leave the land and give it back to the people who owned you. This is a difficult thing for a lot of the Freedmen's Bureau folks to do, and it's harder still for people of African descent to swallow. And so from the very beginning of Reconstruction, Black people have every reason in the world to doubt the sincerity and the power of the federal government in the Deep South. This experiment with 40 acres and a mule that ends rather quickly is going to also linger throughout Black history and American history. And again, we want to keep this in mind for tonight's discussion of Reconstruction, because this idea of the federal government, on the one hand, making these radical, almost revolutionary leaps in trying to help Black people and then retrenching as soon as they do that, this is going to come up time and time again during the Reconstruction era. And again, I already mentioned the Black codes that were put into place all across the South. But I want you guys to keep in mind the timeline of all of this, that the Black codes being put into place almost as soon as the war is over. And these Black codes across the South that severely limit the rights of African Americans, they're going to be the catalyst for pushing a lot of Republicans to support measures designed to grant Blacks citizenship and other rights that they hadn't really fathomed even during the high point of the Civil War. But in addition to the Black codes, you also have a couple of massacres in the South in 1866 in places such as Memphis and New Orleans, where in both situations, Black Americans are asserting their newfound rights, and white Southerners are responding by brutally beating and killing dozens of African Americans in both locations. When news reaches the North of the massacres in Memphis and New Orleans during the summer of 1866, Congress decides, okay, you know what? It's time for us to do more than we have before. It is time for us to formally push for civil rights for African Americans across this country. Again, an idea, an act that had not been fathomed even during the height of the Civil War by most white politicians. And so in 1866, you have the passage of the Civil Rights Act, which is the first of several civil rights acts in American history. It's the first law that specifically defines American citizenship in a federal sense. Now, it's vetoed by President Johnson, but the House overrides his veto, making it law in 1866. Again, this is only a prelude of things to come, that what you're going to see in the next couple of years, in 1866, 67, and onward, is that Congress is really going to take over responsibility for Reconstruction from President Johnson. You're seeing the beginnings of what's called Congressional, or in some historical parlances, radical Reconstruction. And again, this Reconstruction change continues in 1867 when Congress passes the Reconstruction Acts of 1867. They create, as you can see on the map here, 5 military districts across the South. The various states of the South are forced to essentially reorganize their state government. So if you were to research any state government history of the South, like whether it's Georgia, the Carolinas, Virginia, etc., you'll see a constitution in 1865, and then you'll see within the next 2 to 5 years, a new constitution that was written as a result of this Reconstruction Act. In other words, Congress was saying, if you're a Southern state, once part of the Confederacy, for you to be able to re-enter the Union, you're going to have to rewrite your constitution that will grant Black people citizenship rights, and that will also grant Black men the right to vote. Now, that's especially big, because by 1867, Republican congressmen are beginning to realize 2 things. Number one, the only way they can ensure Reconstruction succeeds is if Black men are granted the right to vote and granted political power in the South to make a destiny for themselves. And number 2, Republicans will also realize if we want to build a Southern wing of our party, it will have to be built primarily using Black men. Now, keep that in mind, because that's going to become really important as Reconstruction drags on in the 1860s and especially in the 1870s. Now, again, during the Reconstruction era, this question of who gets to be a citizen is one that's going to come up time and time again. And certainly, it's not just a question about Black people. It's also a question of immigration. It's also a question to an extent of what happens to indigenous folks out west. But to answer some of these questions, Congress is going to push for and eventually with the state government to ensure passage of the 14th Amendment in 1868, which grants citizenship rights to people born in the United States. Now, this is again the first time that the Constitution defines citizenship. If you ever have a chance to do this, go back and read the Constitution. Certainly, there are many more fun things you can do with your time, but I recommend doing that because if you look at the Constitution, you notice that there really isn't anything in there that defines who is and is not a citizen until you get to the 14th Amendment. And that's driven by the expediency of needing to protect the rights of African Americans. Congress knows that even with a Civil Rights Act, any such act could be overturned down the road by a Congress hostile to civil rights. And goodness knows that's going to be proven true within about a decade or so. But the 14th Amendment and Reconstruction more broadly comes during this era in American history when Americans are beginning to rethink the idea of who is and is not American, who is worthy of being an American citizen. And so again, you see cartoons like this one. This is a cartoon again from Harper's Weekly. It's called Uncle Sam's Thanksgiving Dinner. This is from around 1868-69. And if you look at this image for a moment, what you quickly notice is that you see peoples of every ethnicity, color, and hue under the sun represented at this table. You see men, you see women, you see people of African descent, people of East Asian descent, so on and so forth. And again, I cannot stress how incredible this moment is in American history. If you look at the center of the picture, in fact, it even has this idea written of universal suffrage, that we are moving towards an era in American history where everyone will granted the right to vote. Now, again, this is going to be a lot more complicated than that, but these questions of who is and is not American are very much at the center of Reconstruction. And I think for this particular group, as you guys are thinking about organizing politically and socially, again, the Reconstruction era offered a chance for radicals to really get their voices heard, because again, people are considering political alternatives during Reconstruction they hadn't considered even 5 or 10 years ago. It's truly a revolutionary time in many different senses of that particular word. Now, as we see the Reconstruction governments being reorganized across the South, Andrew Johnson has angered Congress one too many times. And eventually Congress tries to impeach Andrew Johnson. Make a long story short, Johnson is impeached by the House, first president to be impeached in U.S. history, but he survives being removed from office by a single vote from the Senate in 1868. However, despite not being thrown out of office, Johnson is so politically wounded that he essentially can't really run for president again. Neither party wants him as a nominee for president, but the 1868 election becomes, for all intents and purposes, a referendum on racism in American society. Now, the Republican Party, when they run their candidates for office in 1868, they run them under the presidential nominee of Ulysses S. Grant, the war hero of the Civil War. And he is pressing a platform called Let Us Have Peace, essentially promising that after years of Reconstruction calamities under President Johnson, he is promising a final and decisive peace all across the country. Democrats, however, are running an explicitly racist platform. And what you see on your screen now is a placard from that year's election. It says, "Our ticket," it has 2 men running for president, and their motto, "This is a white man's country, let white men rule." Now, this is not, again, something geared towards white Southerners. This is a platform being talked about and promoted all throughout the American North in 1868. You have to keep in mind that there is this big fear amongst many white Northerners that with the end of slavery, Black people will come north and essentially take their jobs. There is this economic fear of that. There is a social fear that equality amongst the races will lessen white citizenship and white freedom. And Democrats are certainly playing up that particular theme. At the same time, Democrats are also promising to basically leave the South alone and to end Reconstruction prematurely. So there are a lot of things at stake in this election. And while Grant does win the election, as you can see here, the states in red are Republican states, states in blue are Democratic states. And by the way, states in green are states that have not yet re-entered the Union. Grant does win in an electoral college landslide, but, and I want to stress this, the popular vote is actually quite close, to the point where some historians actually believe that the only reason Grant wins as many states in the South as he does is because of the Black male vote in the South. North Carolina, South Carolina, Alabama, Tennessee, and Florida. Republicans are a little worried. They won the election, but there is a concern that their window for reform during Reconstruction is actually a very small one. Now, when Grant becomes president in March of 1869, he confronts a situation that would overwhelm almost any president. You have Reconstruction in the South. You have, of course, the attempts to expand further westward, involving indigenous tribes and white citizens moving further and further west. And you also have in the U.S. Growing labor tension too, amongst forming labor unions, amongst people who have a new kind of class consciousness formed during and after the Civil War and so forth. President Grant has his hands cut out, has his hands tied. He has a lot to deal with during the Reconstruction period, but a lot of his attention will be focused on the South and trying to make sure Reconstruction is successful there. Now, by 1870, Congress is able to finally ensure passage of the 15th Amendment, the last of the Reconstruction amendments that grants Black men the right to vote. Now, if you read the Constitution, the amendment itself doesn't say we grant Black men the right to vote. Instead, what it says is the right to vote will not be abridged or taken away based on race, creed, or color. However, the amendment does not mention sex, which will become a sticking point for a lot of suffragists during and after Reconstruction period. In the 1860s, there is a move on the one hand to grant Black men the right to vote, but on the other hand, amongst many activists, especially former abolitionists, there is also a move to grant women the right to vote across the country. By 1870, many activists say, well, especially Frederick Douglass, they argue, well, granting Black men the right to vote is of paramount importance. It is for them literally a matter of life or death. We're going to have to put women's suffrage on the back burner, which folks like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton argue was a big mistake. And in fact, it wouldn't be until 1920 when women across the country formally gained the right to vote nationally. Now, the thing about the Reconstruction period is that as much advancement was made for Black political and social rights, we should really remember it as an era also where reform and activism confronted numerous brick walls in terms of how far people were willing to go to make great social change. It was felt that you can only do either civil rights on race or civil rights on gender. You could not do both at the same time. And so women's suffrage takes a severe hit. In fact, what happens to that movement is that it becomes over time somewhat racist, partially because of this era, because they're saying, how can you grant Black men who were enslaved not that long ago the right to vote when you have numerous educated white women who are still waiting to be able to vote? I think this is a really important lesson for us in the here and now as people who are involved in activism and in active citizenship, to think about how political movements even now are really involved in this push and pull of how far one can go, of how far one can imagine a better politics of tomorrow, and how much our own limitations are shaped by the politics of the here and now. Certainly that was a big issue during the Reconstruction period. Now, all throughout the Reconstruction era, of course, you have a large amount of violence all across the South. Thousands of Black people, men and women and children, were killed or simply disappeared, thanks to vigilante groups like the KKK, thanks to white leagues, to red shirts, and so on and so forth. The Civil War, of course, officially ends in 1865, but for all intents and purposes, we have a low-level civil war continuing throughout the 1860s and 1870s. It's this low-level war, this basically, for lack of a better way to put it, a guerrilla war that perplexes Congress and President Grant all throughout the 1870s. Now, the Republican Party becomes desperate and wants to find a way to stop the violence in the South. And so Congress passes a series of acts designed to, A, safeguard elections across the South, to ban violence being used against people who want to vote, to ensure federal oversight of elections, and to ultimately break the back of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, the Klan had been formed in 1866. By the early 1870s, it's become really a mass terrorist organization across the South. They're intimidating voters, they're killing African Americans, they're also killing white Republicans across the South. And President Grant asked for and receives through the Ku Klux Klan in 1871 the ability to call up the militia in each state to fight the Klan. And he sends federal agents down south to investigate and stop the Klan in their attempts to intimidate Blacks and white Republicans alike. Among those he sends are Amos Ackerman, who actually served in the Confederacy during the Civil War, but under the Grant administration leads U.S. Marshals and the U.S. Army in South Carolina to pursue Klan operatives. Now, the Department of Justice is formed during this era really to fight the KKK. And I know that there's a historical irony there, that the Department of Justice was born to fight a white supremacist terrorist organization in the South. And of course, by the 20th century, it's spying on the Communist Party, on NAACP, on numerous organizations fighting for Black freedom. The irony should not be lost on any of us. But when it began, the Justice Department was actually trying to fight and destroy the KKK. Now, despite these measures and despite President Grant's re-election in 1872, violence in the South doesn't really stop, it just changes form. Now, the Klan itself is destroyed by 1872. But what you see across the South is that white Southerners are becoming more brazen in their attacks on Black people in places like the Colfax Massacre in Louisiana on Easter Sunday, 1873. The Klan, of course, originally had members who wore masks, who covered their faces up. By 1873, white Southerners are feeling more comfortable with attacking Black people in broad daylight without wearing any facial coverings whatsoever. In places like Hamburg, South Carolina, you're also seeing massacres of Black men who are trying to utilize their right to vote. In the Hamburg Massacre, the attempt to vote is brutally suppressed by red shirts, people who wore red shirts and were in support of a restoration of a democratic state government in South Carolina that would be ardently opposed to Black freedom, ardently opposed to civil rights, and would be in favor of, quote unquote, restoring white rule. Now, by 1876, many white Americans across the country are tired of the Reconstruction issues plaguing the South. In 1873, of course, you have a panic that year that leads to a Great Depression that really breaks the back of many American workers economically and financially throughout the country. So in the North, there is a greater concern with the Depression than there is with Reconstruction. And by 1876, many Northerners are beginning to suspect the Republican Party just isn't doing a good enough job at Reconstruction, and it's time for the nation to move on. Now, the Republicans had been in power in the White House basically since 1861. They hadn't lost a presidential election yet, and they certainly weren't going to do so in 1876. But as election returns come in from across the country, election night 1876, one thing is quite clear, that, well, nothing is actually clear. And that, in fact, the entire country is on a razor's edge waiting to see who is going to win the election between Rutherford B. Hayes of the Republican Party or Samuel Tilden of the Democratic Party. Now, there are several states holding out their votes, Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina on election night, because election returns in all three of those states are quite controversial. People aren't really sure if the election results are real or if they're fraudulent. There are rampant reports of voter fraud and intimidation all across those states. Eventually, in the winter of 1877, there is a decision made. A council is brought together of members of both houses of Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, and they basically confer and agree to a compromise where the Republicans would be granted the White House once again. In exchange for that, the new Republican president, Rutherford B. Hayes, will withdraw federal troops out of the South, essentially ending Reconstruction. Now, this is typically where our story ends. But again, I want to emphasize that this is really a brief discussion of Reconstruction era. This covers the high points and low points of the period. And so now what I want to do is I would love to take questions. I've been talking a great deal right now, but I really want to hear from you guys about what questions you may have for me this evening.
All right, folks. So we'll ask that you type your questions out for us in the Q&A. And Robert, if you want, you can read them, or I can read them out to you, whatever works better for you.
You can go ahead and read them out to me. That'll be wonderful.
Okay. Hold on, I think we have someone's hand up. Stu, if you have a question, I'll ask you to type it out for us, or anybody else. Okay. First up, we have how can we overcome racial discrimination today and expand social services? So I guess, what does the history tell us about that?
No, that's a wonderful question that started off tonight, because it relates a lot to Reconstruction in general during that time period. So I think one thing I will really push that it's a lesson of the Reconstruction era is the need for creating multiracial coalitions. During the Reconstruction period, you do see some attempts at this in the South with things like the Republican Party, which was in the South based primarily around Black men, but also included white men as well in the South, some of whom fought for the Confederacy or didn't fight for the Confederacy, but nonetheless may have felt it was time for the South to move on. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is that with those multiracial movements, you want to make common cause with other groups that are fighting for similar things. So during the Reconstruction era, you also have the rise of labor unions in the United States. And you do have some small overtures or attempts at some labor unions to try to make common cause with Black people in the South, but not very often. And ironically enough, when Reconstruction comes to an end in 1877, around that same time, you do have also the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, which was the largest labor action in the country up to that point, which brought the nation to its knees. Again, I think to answer your question, you want to think about multiracial coalition building, and you want to think about multi-issue coalition building as well. Being able to put those coalitions together and then using the political muscle to make change. I think that's where you have to start in the here and now. That's a major lesson you can draw from the Reconstruction period.
All right. So next up, we have the election results showed that New York and New Jersey consistently supported the anti-Black Democratic Party. Why was that?
Well, that's another great question. In both states, although both states had abolished slavery early in the 19th century, that of course did not mean they were pro-Black, certainly far from it. And especially in New York, there is this fear of Black economic competition. New York City in particular, during the 19th century, had been the center of race riots. During the war itself, there were the draft riots of 1863, where largely Irish immigrants riot against draft laws and simply say they're not going to fight for Black freedom. that idea continues on during Reconstruction. And it's important to note too, if you want to go back even much further than that, during the colonial period in American history in the 18th century, New York especially was a place where slavery not only existed, but slavery was like a vibrant part of the history of New York City. That will reverberate even after the end of slavery. And certainly in both New York and New Jersey, politically, were tied not just to anti-Black politics, but also more ardent democratic states. So that should be kept in mind too. The Democratic Party in the 19th century was very much a white man's party. So that helps to explain why both of those states are consistently going to the Democrats during the Reconstruction period.
Okay, next up we have, what organizing, protest, resistance did Blacks in the South engage in during Reconstruction?
Well, they engaged in resistance a number of ways. The biggest way, of course, was voting, but they didn't just leave it there. I'm not going to come to you tonight and tell you voting is the salve for everything. But Black men especially sought voting as a way to help them get what they wanted long term. So they organized in the Republican Party, certainly, but they also organized in what were called union leagues. Now, union leagues across the country were organizations formed primarily by veterans of the Civil War who fought for the Union side during that conflict. And they would celebrate the Union cause. There were places where veterans could unite. But in the South, the union leagues became one of the earliest ways for Black people to organize, not only to vote, but to organize in other social ways, other political ways. It's also worth noting a lot of union leagues promoted gun ownership and using guns to protect yourself. The idea of self-defense amongst African Americans was prevalent throughout the South for obvious reasons, but that was also a form of resistance as well. So again, you have the union leagues on the one hand, Republican Party on the other hand, the use of the vote to put Black people in office, especially in places like South Carolina, using the vote to try to achieve concessions from the federal and state governments, and so forth. A lot of the things that you see in the 20th century in terms of organizing, especially amongst African Americans, you're already beginning to see in the 19th century during the Reconstruction period. But again, all of that is tied to this idea of armed self-defense too. I know I described a lot of massacres this evening, but in a lot of other instances, you do have Black people defending themselves against the KKK, against white leagues, and so forth.
Okay, next up we have, can you talk about the economic proposals of the radical Republicans to redistribute land and power to the emancipated Black people? Were any of those plans close to being implemented?
Sure. So one of the plans, the one that's most prominent, of course, was pushed forward by Thaddeus Stevens in the House of Representatives. Now, Congressman Stevens and some other Republicans argued that the land that had been purchased and owned by slaveholders before and during the Civil War should be redistributed to recently freed Black people. Now, this is especially important for a socialist reading group, because Thaddeus Stevens wasn't able to get the kind of support he had hoped for in Congress because many of his colleagues, even other radical Republicans, said, well, wait a minute now. If the federal government takes land away from former slaveholders and gives it to Black people, this sets a precedent for the redistribution of wealth. People were already saying in the 1860s, we have to be careful about how far we go with this, because if we're saying that we can just give property willy-nilly to people like this, then what's to stop people from demanding other economic guarantees from the federal government and so forth? And this isn't just a conspiracy theory for them. You know, this is the era, remember, in the 1860s, you already have ideas of communism and socialism making their way from Europe to the United States. You already have folks in Europe reading Karl Marx seriously. You already have Americans reading Karl Marx seriously. In 1870, 71, you're going to have the Paris Commune. And as a matter of fact, people are going to see that this attempt at a radical government in Paris, France. They're going to say, well, look, that is an example of how far Reconstruction might go if we are not careful. And so while Stevens proposes this idea, most people in Congress gradually kind of just walk away from it. Now, what does happen is in 1865, 66, Congress does pass the Southern Homestead Act. Now, you already have the Homestead Act of 1862, which was basically a law where the government purchased millions of acres of land out west and sold it to white Americans at very cheap prices. And the idea was that if you bought the land, you can go out west, settle the land, and after a number of years, if you paid off your debt, own the land forever. They passed a Southern Homestead Act trying to do the same in the South, in places like Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, where they purchase the land from slaveholders and try to redistribute to both Black and white Southerners. Again, they have to pay for it to get this land, but the Southern Homestead Act isn't nearly as successful because most of the land is actually quite worthless. It's not good land to farm on, it's not arable land. It quickly becomes a failure of the Reconstruction era. Now, here in South Carolina, on the other hand, you do have a state government during the Reconstruction period that creates what's called a land commission, the only kind of its type throughout the country that actually purchases the land from slaveholders and basically says, whether you're Black or white, if you rent this land for a certain number of years and pay off your debt purchasing the land, you can own the land in perpetuity. South Carolina is the only Southern state to try that, to essentially try a form of wealth redistribution. And that's really because the Black presence in South Carolina politically is so large. I mean, this is the only state that actually has a majority Black legislature at one point. It's also a state that sends several Black congressmen to Washington, D.C. during the Reconstruction era, has a Black Secretary of State at one point. It is really the most radical place for Reconstruction during this era. So the Land Commission is actually in place from 1869 until roughly 1890 when the project's finally brought to an end. But certainly those kinds of measures were being talked about, but many people pushed back against them because, again, they argued if we do this for Black people, it could lead to a slippery slope in terms of wealth redistribution in the future.
Okay, we had a couple people ask a question related to this, so I'm going to bump that one up.
Sure.
Could you talk a bit about Du Bois's concept of the general strike and the ways formerly enslaved people were involved actively in the Civil War and Reconstruction?
Oh yes, this is a topic that is really important to understanding the Reconstruction era and American history more broadly. Now, for those who don't know, Du Bois's general strike thesis it comes from his book Black Reconstruction in America, released in 1935. Du Bois's idea is basically this: that Black people not only freed themselves during the Civil War, but by taking away their labor from the Southern economy, they essentially instituted a general strike during the war, crippling the Confederate economy, breaking the back of the Confederate war effort, and helping to ensure federal victory during the war. Now, this is an idea that amongst historians is not controversial at all. And what we do know is that during the Civil War era, upwards of over 500,000 slaves fled their plantations either towards Union lines or in some cases just fled to swamps across the South and just stayed there for the duration of the war. But this thesis is important because, again, it reminds us that Black people practice agency during the Civil War in ways that simply go beyond the right to vote or even go beyond soldiering and fighting for the Union Army. While you had 500,000 slaves escaping to federal lines, the other 3.5 million enslaved people had everyday acts of resistance where they may have worked a bit slower, where they may have broken tools, they may have feigned sickness, so on and so forth. These are all ways, again, that Black people are already showcasing a political consciousness. They are aware that the war is about them, and that if the war is a victory for the federal government, it'll be a victory for them too. Now, during the Reconstruction period, you do continue to see this idea of how do you use economic and political power as Black people to achieve change. But again, without that support from the federal government, it becomes harder to do so. But the general strike thesis that Du Bois puts forth argues essentially that if it weren't for Black people leaving plantations, if it weren't for Black people both actively and passively resisting slavery, then it's quite possible the Union government loses the Civil War. In other words, there is no United States government right now without that general strike thesis being true.
Okay. Were there any instances of the Freedmen's Bureau program or Reconstruction writ large resulted in sentiments of class solidarity in the South across races?
Now, see, this is really the big thing that you do see on a small level across the South, but not as often as one would hope. Now, the thing is that during Reconstruction, 1860s, early 1870s, you do have some poor whites, some even well-to-do whites, who join the Republican Party because they're saying that the antebellum South didn't really help me at all. Or they're saying it's time for the South to move on, to move forward. But this idea of a class solidarity across racial lines, while it never quite comes to fruition in the South, that is the biggest fear that plantation owners had before the Civil War. It's a major fear of the political class in the South after Reconstruction too. You see this with the populist movement in the South in the 1890s, when there is an attempt at a black-white class solidarity movement that is somewhat successful, but it's ultimately beaten back. But this was actually something that, if it had been achieved through Reconstruction, could have greatly altered the course of American history. It's just that while you did have blacks making these overtures to poor whites across the South, saying that, hey, the Land Commission is for you too. Hey, universal education is for you too. All the reforms pushed in the Reconstruction era in the South were designed to help both whites and blacks alike. And yet, the Democratic Party of the South was able to convince white people that actually these reforms, while they do help you, they aren't really for you, that we have to roll these back or severely weaken them for the sake of destroying black rule throughout the South. And so you do have some attempts at this, really more so from black people than from white people. But it is one of the great missed opportunities of the Reconstruction era. And if you want to think in terms of counterfactuals, if that had been achieved in the South, Reconstruction probably looks very different.
Okay, can you discuss what the political relationship between the former white planter class and poor independent farmers was in the process of Reconstruction? Were there any substantial efforts to exploit antagonisms between these white political forces and isolate the former planter class?
Sure. I mean, certainly that is a big part of the story of not just Reconstruction, but of Southern history writ large. I know that Carrie Lee Merritt's book, Masterless Men, is a really good primer on that relationship between the white planter class and not just poor whites, but also independent, what we call yeoman farmers. Now, before the Civil War, there was always a fear amongst the planter class in the South that poor whites and enslaved Africans might join forces to overthrow their way of life. And to them, the yeoman farmers, the independent farmers were always like the wild card in this equation. They weren't sure they could be fully trusted or not. And so before the Civil War, Southern planters would often tell yeoman farmers, hey, you can be like us, you can purchase slaves, but in order to do that, you have to help us to ensure the existence of the slave system in perpetuity. Now, after the Civil War, certainly planters are trying to make this case to both independent farmers and poor whites alike, really leaning more heavily on this idea of racial solidarity in the face of black rule and black self-government and civil rights, and saying that if you want to keep your privileges as a white person in Southern society, you have to join us. Now, again, this is fraught with considerable intra-racial tension amongst white Southerners. For example, after the Reconstruction era, as I mentioned a moment ago, you do have the rise of the populist movement, where many white independent farmers are saying, you know what, these post-Reconstruction regimes in the South are not really looking out for me. And perhaps for some of them, joining politically with black farmers was more advantageous than helping out the white planter class or the wealthy in Southern society. But again, that happened in the 1880s and 90s, but it was decisively defeated at the ballot box, at the polls. Again, racism was just too powerful a force for them to overcome. And certainly in Reconstruction, you see some of this as well, where, for example, the Land Commission, white South Carolinians are asked to boycott it. So you have poor whites who could have used those services in the 1860s and don't do so because they're convinced by the planter class that this government is essentially illegitimate. Now in the 1870s, you do finally begin to see more white South Carolinians leasing land through the Land Commission because, again, they see it as a useful service. But there are some divisions amongst white Southerners, between the planter class and independent farmers and poor whites. Those divisions are carefully papered over, and instead what you see is an appeal to racial solidarity that overwhelms any sense of class consciousness or any sense of advancement that could have been achieved during this era.
Hey, next up, how significant was the economic collapse of 1873 in ending Reconstruction? Did the capital elites in the North essentially give up at that point rather than in 1877? If so, how key were the interests of capitalist elites in driving Reconstruction?
You know, it really would be, you could make an argument, and I think many historians have, that Reconstruction, for all intents and purposes, does end in 1873. Now, by saying that, you have to keep in mind that President Grant does try to continue enforcing Reconstruction laws up until 1876. In fact, Congress does pass one final Civil Rights Act in 1875, the most sweeping of the Civil Rights Acts passed in that era, that guarantees Black access to all public facilities, even private facilities, rail cars, etc. That Civil Rights Act actually gets overturned by the Supreme Court in 1883. But in terms of your question about the importance of Northern capitalists, I think that cannot be overstated. Once the Panic of 1873 sets in, and once the national economy is in ruins, again, this is the start of what some call the Long Depression. It lasts up through the 1890s. And really, that panic is going to influence American politics in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. Really, two generations are impacted by this economic calamity. But the thing is that Reconstruction was already on a precipice of failure. In other words, the support for it was razor thin in the North. But the panic, what that does is it essentially gives Americans in the North a reason to stop caring about it entirely, to say that, well, we have more pressing economic concerns at home. And certainly for Northern capitalists, they're interested not only in economic recovery, but long-term, Northern capitalists are looking at reinvesting in the South, right? And so in the 1880s and 90s, you have this idea of a new South economy, where Northern capitalists and their Southern counterparts are trying to put money in the South in terms of building new factories, for building the railroad system, essentially making the South open for business once again. And to many of them, Reconstruction may not necessarily be an impediment, but it's certainly not a help either. And so by the time we get to the 1890s, and a Booker T. Washington speech where he's talking about unifying economically, about staying separate politically, one of the things that Booker T. Washington and his white Southern counterparts in the New South are arguing is that, you know, whatever happened with Reconstruction, today, right now, the South is open for business. And a lot of that begins in the 1870s with the Panic of 1873 and with the South's desperate need to attract Northern capital and Northern investment. And certainly for Northern capitalists, they're much more concerned with economic growth than they ever were with political advancement or social freedom in the South.
Okay. 1892 general strike in New Orleans was a good model of where that alliance worked and how it was broken. How can we, as leftists, as DSA, as people, best work to reinsert the political lessons and the narratives of Reconstruction into popular discourse and K-12 education after decades of Klan-written history books and their modern adaptations?
That is a wonderful question. And I think the first thing we can do and this is going to sound very simplistic, but I think this is a good place to start, is to talk to our neighbors and friends about Reconstruction. Tell them that the Reconstruction era still lives with us today. And I think like right now is a good time to do this, precisely because of the questions about Confederate memorials, Confederate statues tied to Black Lives Matter. This is as opportune a time as any to talk about the importance of history to social movements. To give you another example of this, during the Civil Rights era, folks like Martin Luther King Jr., John Lewis, and so many others, they would invoke the Reconstruction era as a model by which to build social equality and solidarity across racial and class lines. People refer to the Civil Rights Movement as the second Reconstruction just for this reason. But I think in the here and now, classes like this one really help to get the word out. I think in something as simple as getting folks voted on the school boards. I think one thing the left should look at in the here and now is the importance of school board elections. You think about how the conservative movement in America since the 50s has really utilized local elections to build a power base on the one hand and to also build a bench for larger runs for federal election later on. I think the left can do the same thing. You run folks for school board, for city councils, et cetera, and it's there where these fights over education are actually fought. I think also exploring the model of freedom schools that you saw during the Civil Rights Movement with people like Septima Clark and others, who would set up schools across the South to educate people on their citizenship rights. That's a model we can also use. I mean, this very school is an example of that too. So I think there are some ways, both in terms of politics and also in terms of everyday organizing and activism, where we can find ways to really help people understand why not only does the Reconstruction era matter, but to also understand why knowing that actually matters in the first place. I think a lot of people tend to think of history as just this thing that's in books and that's it, but history is still with us. It shapes our everyday lives. And I think we're realizing that now during this era of protest, this era of Black Lives Matter, but it's going to be up to us to continue to push that forward.
Don't forget too that you can share the video for this that we will post on the night school website. It's also available on YouTube, so you can share it with your friends and such. Next question. You mentioned the centrality of control of Black labor to the process of Reconstruction. What labor regime ultimately emerged? Were former slaves able to extract substantive concessions within this process?
Well, that's another interesting question, and I think it depends on when you stop the clock. Now, during the Reconstruction period, Black laborers are able to extract some concessions, but on the whole, unfortunately, not really. This is also the era of the rise of sharecropping. And sharecropping, those of you who don't know, was a system where it exploited both Black and white workers in the South. It's this idea that as a worker, you live on the landowner's land, you work the land, and you earn a certain amount of money from working those crops. Now, it sounds good in theory until you realize that you purchase your tools from the landowner, you purchase your home from the landowner, you purchase the land itself from the landowner. And then the end of the planting season, when you make your money, you give back how much you owe to the landowner and you keep what remains. Unfortunately, most sharecroppers remain in debt year after year after year. This process begins during Reconstruction. And so while you do have examples of Black land ownership throughout the South, there are many more Black people who are ensnared in this sharecropper system. And it's worth noting, this is going back to the previous questions about class solidarity and Black-white solidarity in the South. It is also worth noting that the majority of sharecroppers were actually poor whites. And this system of sharecropping lasts deep into the 20th century. It becomes a major impetus for attempts at labor organizing that often are not successful. You have some examples where they are, like 1892, for example, in New Orleans. But for the most part, Black workers have a difficult time making those concessions real and tangible on the ground. Now, ironically enough, they start to get more concessions during the Great Migration period in the 20th century when more Black people are moving north from the South. And Southerners are beginning to realize we're losing a major part of our labor force. Not just African Americans, but also poor whites are moving across the country too to escape the system of sharecropping. But again, the concessions are few and far in between, but this is why things like land ownership become so important in the 20th century as a model of Black freedom. I mean, every generation talks about 40 acres and a mule for a particular reason, because they understand that economic self-determination is at the heart of any real freedom in American society.
So are there instances of Black people gaining power in the South in the time period after gaining the right to vote? And how would you evaluate the success of Reconstruction?
Sure. So, that was one thing that I kind of glossed over in the overall presentation. But really quickly, I do want to share my screen one last time, because I can actually show you, I'm not going to tell you about this, but I want to actually show you what I'm talking about here. So I'm going to share my screen one more time. Here we are. Okay, so you asked about political power in the South, right, during this era. And you do have several Black congressmen being voted to Congress in the 1860s and 1870s from really the South, from South Carolina, from Georgia, North Carolina, Mississippi, and elsewhere. These congressmen are all Republicans, of course. And again, I want you to think about how extraordinary this is, that you have, within 10 years, people going from being enslaved in the South to being in the halls of Congress. Arguably, though, the more important thing is Black rule in state government. So in South Carolina, one of the houses of the legislature here is majority Black. The Secretary of State in South Carolina is also African-American at one point. Places across the South have Black sheriffs, Black mayors, Black members of Congress, as mentioned before, Black aldermen, so on and so forth. You have thousands of Black people who are serving in offices in state and local offices throughout the Reconstruction period. We often focus on just the congressmen of the era, these gentlemen you see here, but what's equally important is that you have Black people in all kinds of political offices throughout the South. Now, the high point of this is the 1870s. And you do still have Black congressmen going to Congress as late as 1901, when George H. White of North Carolina is the last Black person in Congress from the Reconstruction era. But arguably what's more important is Black political rule in local and state governments. And one of the things that happens with the memory of Reconstruction, going back to the question about education during the Reconstruction era, is that people across the country began to argue, well, these Republican governments, especially those with Black members in them, were way too corrupt, had high taxes, a low return on investment, and so forth. They were too corrupt, had too many corrupt members in them, when in fact, that was just a way of life through the Gilded Age and the Reconstruction era. But many of these Black politicians pursued things like universal education for all. In South Carolina, they become supporters of the Land Commission and redistributing land from the slaveholders to poor whites and Blacks alike. The thing is that the Reconstruction era sees this high tide in Black political power across the South that would not return for a century. For example, you would not have a Black person from the South in Congress again until 1972. You would not really have Black power in terms of politics, in terms of state government offices and sheriffs and all that kind of stuff until the 1960s, 1970s. Again, a century after the end of Reconstruction. So there are plenty of examples of Black men in particular being instrumental in the Reconstruction era as politicians. But that history has been largely subsumed and forgotten about, really intentionally, because it wants to downplay the way in which Black people can be political actors and can be politically important. And they certainly were during the Reconstruction period.
I think this is a good question in particular because it gets to this point about talking with your friends and neighbors. I want to ask, can you explain the argument that people make when they say that Republicans are the one that freed the slaves or Republicans used to be Democrats?
Okay, so that's a good question because I think it points to some of the problems with our current discourse on history. For one thing, it's a mistake to say Republicans in the 1860s are Democrats of right now, or vice versa, because they have different political issues. I mean, certainly you don't have Democrats today talking about civil service reform or the tariff the way the two parties were back in the 1860s and 1870s. But when people say that, what they're really saying is which party was most, either you could look at it through the lens of was most pro-Black, or on the flip side, who more cynical about it, which party was the most not anti-Black. Certainly during the Reconstruction era, the Republican Party favored civil rights. Republican Party pushed emancipation during the later years of the Civil War. In fact, when the war begins, some of its members are abolitionists. Most Republicans, not all, were against the spread of slavery westward. And that's one of the leading causes of the Civil War. But again, it's a mistake to simply say they were the Democrats of their day, because again, part of why they support Black civil rights after Reconstruction begins is not just out of the goodness of their hearts, but because they recognize Black men as being a voting base in the Deep South. They also recognize that if they want to maintain a national hold on the White House, they're going to have to do better in the South than they have before. I think there are similarities there in terms of how Democrats today see the Black vote as critical for their continued political power nationally. But on the flip side, the question becomes, well, how much are they willing to do to actually earn that vote? And certainly by the 1870s, Republicans were stepping back from really enforcing Reconstruction the way they should have. And so when people say this, that Republicans freed the slaves, that Republicans were the Democrats of their day, it's missing the nuance of the era. It's missing the fact that the big reason for both of those things even being in the air politically now is because Black people during the Civil War, fleeing slavery, and during Reconstruction, organizing for political power, trying to resist the KKK and other organizations, they really pushed Republicans to take this on more ardently. And at the same time, a lot of it was also political expediency for the Republican Party. I think, again, you want to be careful by taking the politics of 2020 and laying them on the politics of 1868 or vice versa. They aren't quite the same thing, although there are some common themes, and the themes being not just Black political power, but also ideas of class solidarity, wealth redistribution, and so on and so forth.
So do we know how the Reconstruction in the U.S. was looked upon by Marxists and other leftists in Europe? To what extent do you believe Reconstruction fits within the Marxist framework of a bourgeois revolution?
Yeah, so this is actually a really interesting question. Now, I want to start this up by talking about Marx and Engels and what they're writing about during the Civil War. Of course, some of you probably already know Marx and Engels wrote in support of the Union cause during the Civil War. They even wrote letters to President Lincoln praising his presidency, praising the Republican Party, and so forth, because they essentially saw the Republican Party and its belief in free labor, free soil, and free men as sort of being on the step towards that ultimate revolution down the road. Now, in terms of a bourgeois revolution, I think certainly in Europe at the time, what's interesting about Marx and Engels is that they don't really write much about Reconstruction, as far as we know. But there is this sense in Europe that Reconstruction can go in a number of ways. And on the flip side, in the US, Americans are using Europe and the radicalism that you see in Europe as a crutch to argue against further reform Reconstruction, saying that, hey, we don't want the Paris Commune to break out in the American South, for example. But certainly this idea of the Reconstruction era being a bourgeois revolution is one that even historians have argued about over the last century or so. And there are a number of ways to look at it. On the one hand, you can see the Reconstruction era as being a second American Revolution. That's what Eric Foner refers to it as. You can see it as this era of lost opportunity, as both Foner and Du Bois, many historians, argue. On the flip side, you have folks like Alan Guelzo, who argues that Reconstruction, while it was a reform in America, it was a reform movement, it wasn't quite as radical as we like to think it was. Because again, the contours of even what most Blacks wanted was just ownership of land and to be left alone. And the question becomes, well, how radical is that actually in terms of thinking about leftism and radical movements of the 19th and 20th centuries? So in some sense, you could see it as a bourgeois revolution that incorporated into the fold Black people as well as white. But however you want to see it, it is certainly an incomplete revolution. And it's one that leftists in the 20th century in America had to wrestle with. If you look at, for example, the writings of Black leftists throughout the 20th century, whether you have Hubert Harrison or Claudia Jones or members of the Black Panther Party or Harry Haywood, so on and so forth, they often come back to Reconstruction at this moment where things could have gone further but didn't quite make it that far. And Du Bois with Black Reconstruction, that book is very much a Marxist interpretation of the Reconstruction era. Now, ironically, other Black leftists in the 1930s condemned Du Bois's Black Reconstruction book because they argued that it was an example of vulgar Marxism, that it wasn't a fully realized, a fully thought out Marxism. They thought that Du Bois was just using a Marxism framework that was actually quite weak at its surface to talk about Reconstruction. And so Black leftists like Abram Harris and others were quite critical of Du Bois for his interpretation of Reconstruction, in which they argued that he didn't go quite far enough in a really, truly Marxist analysis of the era. But certainly Reconstruction has been an era that has really informed American Marxists since then, in terms of what can and cannot happen in the American system. And the questions you guys are asking this evening about race, class, the capitalist system, and so forth, they are again all tied together in this Reconstruction narrative.
Next up, if freed people had received their 40 acres and a mule, how might the U.S. history have been different, especially for Black Americans, presuming white terrorist organizations, et cetera, still existed?
Well, now see, there's the rub, isn't it? Because it's hard to imagine that happening without the KKK and other groups also being around. But let's say, for the sake of this counterfactual, that Black people are able to own hundreds of thousands of acres of land all throughout the South during and after Reconstruction. It gives them an economic base from which to be more politically independent. Remember, again, with sharecropping arising during the Reconstruction period and afterwards, you also have, at the same time, limits to Black political power in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. And indeed, by the end of the 19th century, most southern states have already passed laws that essentially ban most Black people, Black men, from having the right to vote. And not based on color, because the Constitution forbids that, but based on things like poll taxes, literacy tests, etc. But if they have land ownership, that equation changes dramatically. Keep in mind that most of the folks voting in the South in the late 19th century either owned land or at the very least had enough income to pay their poll tax. More Black people who have land, who are able to be part of the capitalist system, so to speak, able to pay their poll taxes means more people can, in theory at least, participate in the political system as well. Keep in mind that Black politics doesn't come to an end at the end of Reconstruction, it continues onward. And in the 1880s and 1890s in particular, Black people who own land become members of the Populist Party across the South. And they're the ones who are making common cause with white farmers to push back against the redemption governments of the American South. So it's an interesting counterfactual, and it's one that, I'll put it this way. If you pull that thread of Black land ownership, right? Let's say 40 acres and a mule is a national program. Sooner or later, white Americans are going to ask questions about wealth redistribution other ways as well. I mean, certainly we already have the example of the Homestead Act in the 1860s, of the federal government giving land out west to white people, but they may start saying, well, why stop at land? Why not ownership of factories, ownership of corporations and the like? It would certainly open up a wedge to think about economics differently if the federal government shows it has this kind of power. And this is again why a lot of people in Congress were opposed to Thaddeus Stevens' ideas of a radical redistribution of land.
Okay, so next up we have what intellectual and political traditions and organizations emerge among the Black people in the South from the experience of Reconstruction?
All of them. That's kind of a simplistic answer, but in essence, every Black social and intellectual movement of the late 19th, early 20th centuries emerges from this era, right? So the idea, say, of integration and trying to have a multiracial society, that certainly comes into play during the Reconstruction era. But also the seeds of separatism in terms of Black Americans doing well for themselves and staying to themselves is also part of this era too. In fact, there's a really interesting interplay between integration and separation. And again, I think for your listeners in particular, I want to make it clear that Black intellectual history is not simply integration versus separation or integration versus nationalism. Often most thinkers are playing with both of those ideas at the same time, trying to see what's best for Black people at a particular moment in American world history. And so, for example, during the Reconstruction period, you have the rise of what will become known as historically Black colleges and universities. Claflin University, the school that I work at, is an HBCU in South Carolina. It has been around since 1869, since the high tide of the Reconstruction era. Howard University was created in 1867, again, during Reconstruction. You really cannot divorce Black education from the Reconstruction era, especially need to create and maintain Black education and Black schools. At the same time, all Black intellectual traditions in the U.S., whether integrationists, nationalists, leftists, so forth, or liberal, they all in some ways point back to Reconstruction. Really, in terms of Reconstruction as being this pivotal moment in Black history where things could have turned out differently, right? Whether you're a nationalist or pro-integration, whether you're a liberal or a leftist or a socialist, you're thinking Reconstruction is a place where we kind of have to start our political thought, our political system. And it's no coincidence, again, that people like Du Bois, Martin Luther King, and so many others harken back to Reconstruction as an era of lost opportunities, but also as an era of hope. They're saying that, hey, if we could achieve what we did back then with what little power we had, think what we could achieve now with even more effort and more numbers and more determination. So it certainly influences all of those movements. I would even go so far as to argue that Bayard Rustin, the socialist who in the 1960s pushes for a move from protest to politics. In a way, Rustin is arguing for a need to go towards the polls because of Reconstruction, using Reconstruction as an example. If you look at Kwame Ture, former Social Carmichael, and his book, co-written with Charles Hamilton, Black Power, at the end of the decade, they're talking about Black power ostensibly as Black political power. And they're saying, look back to the Reconstruction era and afterwards, that the places where Black people had the most power were places where they were voting the largest number of votes, places where they were voting as a block of Black votes, right? So again, theorists are using the Reconstruction era as an example of what can be achieved with a little more power. And this is, again, prevalent all throughout Black intellectual and political history.
Okay, next question. Among the former Confederates who made it to the federal government, was Amos Ackerman typical in his willingness to enforce law and order and federal control, or were they more likely to back up state/local governments as they tried to undo everything?
Really, most of the folks who are working for President Grant are Southerners who were actually willing to enforce federal laws and enforce civil rights laws. Ackerman being one example. Another example is James Longstreet, who was a general during the Civil War for the Confederacy, and then after the war is over, has a change of heart, becomes friends with Ulysses Grant, and becomes a Republican in the Deep South. Now, Longstreet's story is actually an interesting one because when Longstreet backs Grant, he becomes a general of the militia in Louisiana. And in fact, in 1874, he leads an all-Black militia in combat against the all-white White League, which is trying to take over Louisiana state government. Now, the irony of an ex-Confederate general leading Black troops in the battle against white terrorists is one that shouldn't be lost, but it is one of those examples of Southerners who supported Grant, who become ardent supporters of civil rights and Reconstruction. Again, if you're a white Southerner in the federal government, as in like working for the White House, working in the executive branch, you're going to be someone who supports these laws. Now, on the other hand, in Congress, the Black congressmen from the South are really the ones who are for maintaining civil rights. But during the 1870s, you have more and more white Democrats being elected to the Congress. And in fact, by 1874, Democrats have the majority in Congress, and they're able to start pushing back on these civil rights reforms.
Okay. Did former enslaved people join labor unions or create their own after the Civil War?
They did try to create some semblance of labor organizations, certainly in places like in the Union Leagues, for example. Those were not quite labor unions, but could be used to that extent. You do have Blacks trying to form cooperative organizations across the South. But really, in terms of Black union organizing, it really grows by leaps and bounds after Reconstruction, like the Knights of Labor, for example, or in the 1890s, the populist movement, and going into the 20th century. But you do have attempts at that. They aren't terribly successful, but they do provide models for organizing down the road. So there's certainly attempts to do that. But keep in mind, with the sharecropping system especially, it's very difficult to organize labor rights because, again, so many folks are in debt and they're just trying to scrape by day to day.
Okay. Can you tell us what the class composition of the KKK was?
Well, so the Klan is really interesting because during the Reconstruction era, what happens is that the Klan is seen by many, North and South, as being composed of largely poor whites. Now, there are some members of the Klan who are well-to-do whites, but what happens is that during and after Reconstruction, the Klan is condemned as this organization of mostly poor whites. Now, this is in comparison with the White Leagues and the Red Shirts of the later Reconstruction years. And most of those people are seen as middle-class whites, some upper-class whites. They are the better members of white society than the Klan. The Klan is dismissed as a terrorist organization of largely poor whites, although there are some leaders of it who are well-to-do white people in Southern society. For the most part, the class composition is largely poor, lower middle-class white people. Again, that is in marked contrast to, say, the White Leagues of the later Reconstruction era. And it also offers an interesting comparison and parallel with the Civil Rights Movement, where during the Civil Rights era, the 50s and 60s, in the 20th century, the idea is that the Klan is made of mostly poor whites who are illiterate or just too violent, whereas the white citizens' councils are made up of white businessmen across the South who offer a more genteel but equally dangerous form of white supremacy.
Okay. What was the role, if any, of agrarian/populist movements during Reconstruction, and how did they contend with the question of race?
Well, the thing is that those movements, they aren't terribly powerful during Reconstruction because most of them simply don't quite exist yet. When we think of the agrarian or populist movement, that really comes about in the 1880s and 1890s. You do have some small attempts here and there on the ground at cross-class solidarity, as mentioned a moment ago, but it's not really until the 1880s and 90s when farmers are continuing to feel squeezed by the depressionary economy, especially by the lack of access to silver, that you start to see these agrarian movements pop up across the country, not just in the South, but also in the West as well. Now, the thing about the populist movement in the South is that historians for generations have argued about how how pro cross-racial solidarity it actually was. Certainly, Blacks were part of the populist movement. They had a seat at a table politically in some ways, but we shouldn't overestimate this because even though white populists were making common cause with them in some places like Georgia, Tom Watson, in South Carolina, populists are being led by Ben Tillman, a man who is certainly no friend of Black people. And so in some parts of the South, Blacks and whites are working together to create a populist coalition in Georgia, in North Carolina to an extent. But other places like South Carolina, it's just not happening. And so it's very much a mixed bag. And again, it is sort of a lost opportunity that if more whites have been willing to work with Blacks across the South, maybe populism achieves more political gains during the 1890s. But with that said, let's not forget, as I mentioned a moment ago, the 1890s is also an era where Southern state governments are passing laws and building new state constitutions designed to strip Black men of the right to vote. This is again being done not just because of the memory of Reconstruction, but also because of this burgeoning populist movement. And they're trying to cut off this movement at the knees, and they succeed at doing so.
Okay, we have a few more minutes. Next question. What was the relationship between Black political leaders and professionals who emerged out of Reconstruction and the mass of Black sharecroppers, workers, et cetera? Were there significant divisions within the Black community that emerges from Reconstruction?
Well, you know, there are, as always, those class divisions, but a couple of things to keep in mind. The Black political class and professional class during Reconstruction is actually very, very small. But they are having to make appeals to poor Blacks to vote for them. You know, what's their voting base are the sharecroppers, poor Black farmers, et cetera, that they need to stay in office. Now, with that said, you do see during and especially after Reconstruction criticisms of the Black professional class for not doing enough. Part of this comes from poor Blacks, and part of it comes from younger African Americans who grew up in the aftermath of slavery. For example, if you want to see this in action, look up what was being said about Frederick Douglass in the 1880s by folks like T. Thomas Fortune. Douglass, who again is seen as a hero today, at the time, post-Reconstruction era, some thought was actually not radical enough for what Black people needed. And so part of it was class. That's a big part of it. And in fact, this is why Booker T. Washington is so appealing to so many African Americans, because he's able to speak to poor Blacks in a way that W.E.B. Du Bois and others kind of struggled with in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. But also it's a generational divide too, in terms of Black people growing up after slavery demanding more and more and seeing that it's just not happening. But certainly there are these class divisions. They really play into what happens with early civil rights organizations like the NAACP, which when it's first formed in 1909 is seen as primarily an organization for a Black elite and their white liberal allies. Whereas separatist groups or nationalist groups were more accurate, like the Universal Negro Improvement Association of the 1920s, they're able to do a much better job at attracting poor Blacks because they're able to speak to their everyday needs. Whereas NAACP, at least initially, is seen as speaking to these more loftier goals of civil rights and equality that most people just don't see happening anytime soon. Again, a lot of these divisions begin in the Reconstruction era and then go forward throughout Black political and intellectual history.
All right, so we are almost out of time. So I apologize, we still have a few questions left, but I don't think we're going to get to it. I wonder if you have any reading suggestions for us.
Yes. So of course, I mentioned at the beginning of our Q&A, Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, again, written in 1935. It's pretty readily available. In fact, if you go online, you can actually find a PDF of it. If you search, it won't take you too long to find it. I have some other books here beside me. Eric Foner's Reconstruction, and again, this will be backwards on the video screen, but you see what I'm talking about. Eric Foner's Reconstruction is a seminal work in the Reconstruction era. It really offers this idea of it being an unfinished revolution. Foner also wrote The Second Founding, which just came out last year about the Reconstruction Amendments. But then other books that I think also address some of the questions that were asked this evening about Black political power in particular. One of my favorites is Stephen Hahn's A Nation Under Our Feet, which really gets at this idea of what Black politics looks like during slavery and Reconstruction and what forms it takes in the South in the 1860s and 70s and moving forward. Another good one is, that's by Stephen Hahn, by the way. Another good one is Hillary Greene's Educational Reconstruction, which gets at how Reconstruction impacts the education system of the South in the 1860s, 70s, and beyond. We don't think about Reconstruction in that way, but Reconstruction touches so much of American society that it's worth evaluating how that looks in a variety of different ways. Gregory Downs has After Appomattox, which is actually about the Union Army's occupation of the South. And basically he argues that the Union Army was just too small in the Civil War drawdown to really enforce that Reconstruction rule throughout the South. Because again, you have only a handful of troops trying to fight off the KKK and the White Leagues, and et cetera. And two final readings real quick. Of course, David Blight's Race and Reunion, which is coming back into the fore because of debates about Confederate statues. If you think about Civil War and memory and also Reconstruction memory, this is a good place to start, because the ideas of the lost cause actually begin during Reconstruction, with Southerners trying to justify why they fought the Civil War and why they were actually right. And then finally, I do want to end with a very recent work from this year called A Black Women's History of the United States by the authors Dana Ramey Berry and Kaylee Nicole Gross. This book on Black women's history is really good because it covers the Reconstruction era from the POV of Black women in particular, and seeing them not just as victims, but as political actors, or rather political actresses in their own right, because they're helping to push Black men to vote for Republicans. They're instrumental in forming of union leagues. They're very important in terms of keeping all this going.
Well, thank you so much to Robert for that great presentation. Thank you so much to everyone for your great questions. And I think Chip is going to tell us a little bit about some upcoming events that we have coming.
Yeah, that was really great. Both the lecture and the questions are both really engaging. Thank you so much for doing that, Robert. And it looks like in the near future, we're probably going to have a Black Reconstruction by W.B. Du Bois reading group. I'll have more information about that at future night schools. But the next two scheduled night schools are July 20th. We're going to have a night school on the DC Budget 101, led by Metro DC DSA endorsed DC Council candidate Ed Lazier. And then on August the 13th, we're going to have a really good night school on education reform and neoliberalism. And that's it.
Thank you, Chip. Thank you, everyone. And have a good night. And check us out on Twitter and like us, subscribe us on YouTube.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed it.